History of the Bay, Master P. Now this is one of the very first history videos I did on TikTok. It got a big reaction. I think one of the reasons is these connections between Master P and the Bay Area. A lot of people really don't know the full story about him, if they know about him at all. So I want to give y'all a little deeper insight into this piece of history as I understand it. Before I really get into it, there's a lot to be said about the connection between the Bay and the South. I mean, first of all, in the black community, a lot of families have a lot of ties to places like Louisiana and Texas. You know, a lot of people have kind of fairly recently in the last century moved to these places looking for work, etc. And there's a lot of family ties and connections between both regions. Other thing that's unique and that these places both have in common is that when it comes to the entertainment industry, there's really two capitals in this country. There's New York City and there's Los Angeles. The reason being is that these cities are just where the industry exists in terms of the studios, the companies, the production places. And the Bay Area and the South, we don't really have that same infrastructure. You can make the argument today that Atlanta is right up there in terms for, at least for hip hop music, but in the early days, like I said, it was really all eyes on those two cities, and even at a certain point, it was really all eyes on New York City. So that being said, in those days when major labels and other people were looking for hip hop talent, of course, the eyes would be on New York artists or LA artists. That being said, in the South and the Bay Area, we have a long tradition of independent music, independent hustling. We're not gonna let the mainstream in LA or New York stop us from doing anything. And that's no disrespect to either of those places. It just is what it is. It's about our mentality. You can look to, you know, cities like Houston and what Jay Prince has done with Rap A Lot Records, and you can look to the Bay with E40, Too Short, and so many other independent pioneers, and you can look at New Orleans with Master P. So Master P's connections to the Bay Area begin in Richmond, California, where he moved there in the late 80s to get away from the New Orleans street life and everything that was going on around him. And I believe his wife has some family in Richmond, so that's where he decided to relocate. And eventually he would bring his siblings with him and pretty much get off to a whole new start in Richmond. He really tried to leave the street life alone, and he saw that the music industry, specifically a record store, was actually a lucrative business. So he decided to open No Limit Records as a record store with $10,000 that he had won in a lawsuit. And through this record store, he ended up meeting a lot of local rappers and a lot of the distributors at the time that were putting the music in the stores. So this is, from a very early point, some really good networking. But it was pretty soon that Pete decided, you know what, I can do this myself. I can rap and tell these stories from my life just as well. And so he started No Limit Records as a record label. And his group was TRU, True, The Real Untouchables. And True had a pretty deep roster at first with Master P, Cali G, Chili Powder, King George, and P's brothers, Silk and C Murder. And he really started recording with the producer K Loop, who's done a lot of work in the Bay Area for a lot of different artists, definitely a legend out here. A lot of people don't also know that Master P's No Limit Records had a distribution deal early on with In a Minute Records. And In a Minute Records was huge in the early 90s. They had groups like Coog Nut and IMP, Huey MC, Totally Insane, RBL Posse, Dre Dog. I mean, In a Minute was a pretty big deal. So as P was wiggling out here in the Bay, he learned that independent hustle of promotion, sales, And, P would market his music to the street hustlers. He would market it to the homeless people and the dope fiends. He would market it to the dealers. He would travel all around the Bay, all around the country, slanging tapes out the trunk. That's the real independent Bay Area hustle. And I don't believe that people were really moving like that outside of the Bay Area at the time on such a major scale. Another reason that P really started taking off is because he got a lot of game from St. Charles. If you don't know who St. Charles is, that's actually E40's uncle. And St. Charles had the music distribution game on lock in the Bay Area. He really understood the independent industry and he knew how to make things wiggle and shake. So St. Charles gave Master P a lot of game. P also toured with Tupac, and as I've covered in previous videos on TikTok and I'll be covering on YouTube, Tupac was a major artist emerging out of the Bay Area. So having that exposure and just being around that whole scene, that really opened up P's eyes to a lot of things. Master P also took classes in business at Merritt College over in Oakland. And you can see that from the beginning. As soon as he hopped in this game, he really had a vision for how he was gonna make No Limit Records into what it eventually became. So with all that game, all that networking, with all those resources, with all that Bay Area independent hustle, after doing a lot of independent projects and stuff with In a Minute and other things and just selling underground tapes, he really went major with his album, The Ghetto's Trying to Kill Me. With that money, Master P had the foundation to do what would become his biggest project at that time, the West Coast Bad Boys. So before I get into the story of West Coast Bad Boys and what that compilation was really about, I gotta break down a little bit more about the compilation in the game in the Bay Area overall. I've done a TikTok video on this. I'll probably do a YouTube video on this as well. There's a lot to talk about, but the idea of a compilation is pretty unique to the Bay Area. It's definitely a different level of independent hustling, and it's a pretty genius idea. I think people should really start bringing these back. But the basis behind it is basically a label or an executive producer will basically lay the financial blueprint and have, the funding to, instead of working with one artist, they will work with multiple artists. Sometimes it would be one producer, sometimes it would be multiple producers. But basically you combine all these talents and you combine all these people who have their own draw individually and you put them all together on one record with some slapping music. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the very first person to do this compilation format was Herm out of San Francisco with the compilation Trying to Survive in the Ghetto. You also had a really important compilation put out by Cell Block Records, the Cell Block compilation that had a lot of Oakland artists on there. And these two projects, they had some classic songs and they did really well. So I'm sure that Master P took notice, either indirectly, just kind of observing from the outside looking in, or he might have been chopping it up with Herm or some of the folks over at Cell Block. I'd have to do a little more research. Maybe I can get to that in an interview down the line. But basically, what I see is being a little bit different from the Trying to Survive in the Ghetto and the Cell Block compilation, whereas those were primarily known as San Francisco compilation or Oakland compilation. With West Coast Bad Boys, Master P decided to go around the whole Bay and work with rappers from all over. So this West Coast Bad Boys project, it had appearances by Totally Insane, RBL Posse, JT the Bigger Figure and the Get Low Players and San Quinn, Coob Nut, Lil Rick, Sibo from Sacramento, Selsky and UNLV, Dre Dog is on there, Rappin' Fote is on there. I mean, it was really like an all-star list of classic artists from the Bay Area who were all starting to bubble around that time on the underground tip. The production was also banging. I gotta give a shout out to the homie Selsky. He did some beats on there. And with P's business skills and with his marketing, that project was able to do really well. I believe it sold over 300,000 out the gate, which is pretty big numbers for an independent album, especially back then in the early 90s. And from there, P just really kept things rocking. And keep in mind, like I said, Master P was representing Richmond on a lot of these projects. And he really was putting on for the Bay Area. You got to give him his props. Master P was smart enough to keep the West Coast Bad Boys movement going, and he dropped a Christmas album, High for Christmas, which honestly, as I see it, that's pretty hilarious concept for an album, but it actually slaps. That's a pretty slapping Christmas rap album. And it's got features from San Quinn and Pizzo and a lot of other Bay Area cats on there. It's really dope. Later down the line, P would drop a West Coast Bad Boys Volume 2 and 3. So he knew that he had something special going on there. At a certain point, probably, through the grapevine back home or even through his travels around the country doing his thing, Master P started to realize that the South was starting to bubble. Like I said earlier, you had Jay Prince and Rap-A-Lot and the Ghetto Boys smashing out of Houston and really starting to take things over nationwide. It started to look like the South was starting to open up as a market. So the thing about Master P is, even though, as I'm explaining, he was a Bay Area rapper, he was representing Richmond, he was working with Bay Area producers, he had a Bay Area sound, you just couldn't deny that there was something kind of different about him, some kind of country, something kind of down south, whether it's the slang or the way he carried himself or the way he talked. It didn't quite fit exactly into this West Coast Bay Area box. But he kept doing his thing. And he kept on pushing, and after the West Coast Bad Boys compilation, he dropped this album, 99 Ways to Die, which hit the Billboard charts, and that started to attract some major label attention. So with this major label attention, with No Limit Records doing good, with all these other side projects, with TRU and everything else going on, Master P started considering taking his formula that he learned and he established in the Bay Area and taking it back to the South. And he would eventually do a similar compilation to West Coast Bad Boys called Down South Hustlers. So P went back to the South, he went back to New Orleans, and he started bringing back some of the rappers from New Orleans like Mia X and some of the producers from New Orleans like Beats by the Pound. And he would bring them back to Richmond to record in his studio and to just kind of learn the game and learn the hustle. And that led to the creation of what would be his biggest song at the time, Bout It, Bout It. And that's something that to this day, Master P is really known for, that saying and that song. It really blew up. It took him to a whole nother level. And that would open the doors for P to do The Ice Cream Man, his very first platinum single and an album of the same name. Now, this was pretty controversial because The Ice Cream Man came out in 1996, and even though it was a nationwide hit and it was so successful, the Luniz and Drew Down had a song and a video for The Ice Cream Man in 1993, and I believe Yuck Mouth had created the song and wrote it and kind of performed it around town in the Bay a long time even before that. So this kind of started off some beef between the Luniz and Master P because, as you know, especially in the early days of hip hop, I don't know about now, but back then biting was a no-no. So I never seen P respond to Yuck Mouth and the Luniz. I don't know personally, I can't say how big of an issue that was for him. I can't even speak on to whether he directly bit the song or not. I mean, you can draw your own conclusions just based on the timeline. But basically around that time, No Limit really relocated from Richmond back to New Orleans. And a lot of those original No Limit artists like King George and Little Rick, I don't believe that they made the transition with Master P back to the South. He started focusing strictly on New Orleans and down South artists. So that was pretty much the end of Master P's relationship with the Bay Area as just being a Bay Area based artist and No Limit being a Bay Area based record label. But like I said, the foundation is there, the history is there, and that is where it all started. So what does all this history mean and why is it important? I mean, first of all, like I kind of touched on at the beginning of this video, I really do feel like the Bay Area is constantly overlooked. So it's important to tell these histories. Master P and No Limit are known worldwide and respected worldwide, but I feel like this piece of the history kind of falls out of the equation when people think of Master P. To Master P's credit, I believe he's spoken on his connection to Richmond plenty of times. He shouted out Richmond in songs even long after leaving the Bay Area. I do know that he's reached out to a couple of Bay Area artists from back in his early days, and he's made attempts to work stuff out with them. I've talked to San Quinn about this. A lot of other older artists from that time that I rock with, like Selsky and Nicotina, they speak highly of Master P, you know. They have nothing but good things to say about him. And again, you have artists like Yuckmouth who, you know, for good reason, don't really rock with Master P like that because of the Ice Cream Man thing, and also just kind of this conception that maybe Master P came to the Bay Area, took a lot of the game, and bounced out. And then again, you have artists like King George that were there from the beginning, but weren't able to come along with Master P on the journey. These are things that I can't really speak on as history because, again, this is like, I can't judge Master P. I can't walk in his shoes. I can't say whether he did the wrong thing or the right thing. What I will say is I respect Master P a lot. No matter what you gotta say about him, you gotta recognize this dude is a very, very smart businessman. And he worked incredibly hard and he believed in himself. And that is usually the difference between an artist that achieves level of success and another artist that doesn't quite get there. There's other little rumors and pieces and personal stuff that I've heard floating around about P in the Bay Area, and I'm not gonna put any spotlight on that. That's not for me to discuss. For me, on the outside looking in, granted I wasn't there. This was when I was really young. I was too young to be around this type of stuff in the game. I've never met Master P. Like I said, I know people who have and who've worked with him. But from my perspective, man, I think P has to be respected. And I think this piece of Bay Area history also has to be respected. And I think people really need to understand that the Bay Area breeds independent bosses like Master P, like Herm Lewis, like JT the Bigger Figure, like E40, like Too Short. This is where the game comes from, of nobody's gonna give us a handout, so we're gonna find our own way. We're gonna hustle records out the trunk. We're gonna overcome any obstacle. And that's true back in the 90s, and it's true today in 2022. Salute to Richmond, California. Salute to Master P. Salute to No Limit. And salute to the Bay Area. And salute to the South too, man. Much love to the South. That independent grind exists down there just as much as it exists in the Bay. Y'all got your own style of doing it. We got our own style of doing it. But it's dope to just see these two regions start to get their shine in more recent years. Again, I'm just actually proud to know that this piece of the history started in the Bay Area. No Limit Records started in Richmond. And this is a dope piece of the history of the Bay.